You remember those pig and elephant fossils that were found scattered throughout the layers above and below the KBS tuff? I'll let Lubenow explain it so eloquently. The pigs won. In the 10-year controversy over the dating of one of the most important human fossils ever discovered, the pigs won. The pigs won over the elephants. The pigs won over potassium-argon dating. The pigs won over argon-argon dating. The pigs won over fission track dating. They won over paleomagnetism. The pigs took it all. But in reality, it wasn't the pigs that won, it was evolution that won. In the dating game, evolution always wins. We've been looking at the various radiometric dating methods used by old Earth advocates who adamantly claim that radiometric dating produces reliable, absolute ages. When it serves their purposes, they are just as quick to reject their own radio dating methods when the ages given don't line up with the evolution column. Dr. Robert Gentry became known for his work on pleochroic halos or radiohalos in the 70s. I highly recommend visiting his websites, either halos.com or halos.us, and checking out his book, Creation's Tiny Mystery. Dr. Gentry was a nuclear physicist working within the defense industry and Oak Ridge National Labs for many years. His extensive work in a variety of fascinating nuclear physics research projects led him to researching zircon crystals. You remember them? Fission track dating in zircon crystals was one of the dating methods used to try to date Skull 1470. So in his research for nuclear waste storage, Dr. Gentry studied radioisotopes within zircon crystals drilled from deep granites, and namely how much or how little radioisotopes would leach into or out of the crystals, especially at higher temperatures underground. He discovered by chance that there was a lot of helium in the zircon crystals. Well, let's go back a few lectures to our nuclear physics for home educators. Remember that alpha radiation is effectively a helium atom. So any alpha radioactivity produces helium. The helium atom is the second smallest atom known to mankind, and it's so small that it will readily leak through pretty much any substrate. It's also an inert gas, so it doesn't bond chemically with anything either. To help balloons retain their helium, you'll notice that they will often first put in a substance affectionately called balloon snot, for obvious reasons. The balloon snot actually coats the inside of the plastic or rubber of the balloon because the helium atom is so small that it will leak right through the rubber or plastic. This is why your helium balloon deflates over a very short time, and the balloon snot slows down the leakage to help keep your balloon afloat for a lot longer after your birthday party. So, if you have zircons in the basement rocks, assigned to the Precambrian and dated by deep time advocates as 1.5 billion years old, when the basement rocks were formed, they also formed these zircon crystals inside the basement rock granite. When the zircon crystals formed, they trapped radioactive uranium and thorium inside them. These radioisotopes then radioactively broke down over time, producing helium gas inside the zircons. Now, zircons are incredibly dense and tough crystals, almost as tough as diamonds. But the helium atom being so small, it still easily works its way through the crystal lattice. The gas diffuses out of the crystal. This was where Gentry first stumbled upon this surprise. There was way too much helium in the crystals. The helium is produced really slowly, but leaks out really fast. There should be a very small amount of helium retained inside the crystal. Instead, Gentry found that 50% or more of the radiogenic helium was retained inside the crystal. Before we go on, I wish to take a few steps back to the Skull 1470 fiasco. You remember that Hereford et al. used fission track dating on the zircon crystals in the 3.9 tuff. They arrived at an age of 2.44 million years, which seemed to support Fitch et al.'s new age of the KBS tuff at 2.4 million years. In 1977, G.A. Wagner of the Max Planck Institute for Physics in Germany wrote a letter to Nature magazine in response to Herford et al.'s dating paper. Wagner cited his own paper in Nature magazine in 1975, where he took historic uranium glassware of known age and performed fission track dating on the glassware. Now, uranium glassware was common from the 1800s through the 1900s, and it is literally uranium-infused glassware. The glass glows as a result, and yes, people would drink from said glasses and eat their supper from the uranium glass plates and bowls. But what Wagner did was really smart, because we know when the glassware was manufactured, and it was manufactured by melting the glass. So this was like turning the glass into lava and resetting the fission track clock. Wagner could now go on, calibrate the fission track dating method based on the fission tracks of this glassware, for which he knew the precise age of manufacture. But get a load of what he wrote in his letter about Herford's work. Many fission track specialists no longer use the decay constant 6.85 value, but now use the decay constant 8.46. There are good reasons for this preference. If this higher value for the decay constant is used, the fission track age of the pumice and the KBS tuff recalculates to 1.98 million years, which would lend support to the potassium argide age measured by Curtis et al. Hold up. This guy is saying the half-life of uranium-238 that Herford et al. Used is no longer valid? And that the half-life they should have used was 19% higher? Whatever happened to constant? The half-life of an element is supposed to be a well-known, well-established number. I mean, that number even affects the safe and reliable operation of nuclear reactors, for crying out loud. You would think their numbers wouldn't be in disagreement by 19%, would you? Right? But wait for it. Here's what Herford and team replied. Wagner has questioned our choice of a decay constant when it is used in conjunction with the fission track glass standards of the U.S. National Bureau of Standards. We get the best agreement for the potassium argide ages of coexisting minerals, and we use it for this reason. Translation. Well, if you use the fission track glass standards here in the U.S., our dating of the KBS tuff matches the dates obtained by Fitch-Miller and many others. So, a benchmark measurement, you would think, was solid in the scientific community. The determined half-life of probably the single most important radioactive element known to and used by mankind. You would think it's a number that would no longer be debated. But here we have experts in their field on two sides of the globe disagreeing about a number foundational to a number of multiple sciences, and they are in disagreement by 19%. Do you think you would pass your university exam for bridge design if your answers were 19% different than the professor's answers? But wait, it gets better. If you take a look at the 1989 reference from the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, where they set the standards that scientists use for things like molecular weights, melting and boiling points, half-life, and decay constants, which apparently aren't that constant, because you can see here they've had a range of values for uranium-238 from the 6.85 that Herford and team used through to the 8.46 that Wagner said they should have used, through to the figure of 8.2 that the consortium arbitrarily decided should be the number everybody should use. But I mean, look at those numbers. Why use 8.2? Why not 11.8? Or why not 6.8? You can build a compelling argument for any of those decay constants, and you wind up with a half-life for uranium-238 of somewhere between 3.64 and 6.277 billion years. A half-life range of 173%. In 2017, geologist Dr. Andrew Snelling published a paper documenting the history of trying to determine the half-life of uranium-238 and 235, critical isotopes used in a plethora of purposes. He showed the research conducted over the previous 84 years, showing the variations in the constant, and ultimately saying, instead, the actual observable, experimentally determined radioisotope decay data suggest that radioisotope decay rates have been decreasing in recent decades. In 2018, Lawrence Livermore Laboratories published a paper which seemed to fall in line exactly with what Dr. Snelling said, showing the historical half-life measurements of uranium-238. And please note that a lot of these guys are switching between decay constant and half-life. They are two different numbers that are directly proportional, and you can calculate them from one another. But as they explain in the abstract of the paper, there's really only been one published half-life for uranium-238 that everybody uses. And that's that one right there. Jaffe et al., who set a standard of 4.47 billion years in 1971. Notice that 47 years later, in the Parsons-Davis et al. Paper, they arrived at a value of 4.456 billion years, slightly lower than that standard. So with all this in mind, let us come back to the zircon crystals. After years of creationists rightfully criticizing the old Earth advocates for parroting their absolutely bankrupt deep-time dating methods, the old Earth advocates said, well, why don't you guys come up with your own dating methods then? So we did. An 8-year research project was launched, partnered by the Institute for Creation Research and the Creation Research Society. The project was titled Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth, or RATE for short. You can now download both volumes of the reports for free from the ICR website here. A lava dome grew over the next couple of years. We now know the actual age of that lava dome because we watched it grow. 10 years later, Dr. Steve Austin from Institute for Creation Research, now headquartered in Dallas, Texas, collected samples of that lava dome and processed the rocks through the potassium-argon dating method. 5 samples from the same lava dome, the same rock, returned ages of 350,000 to 2.8 million years old. Allegedly, the most reliable, most accurate radio dating methods show that the lava falls are older than the deepest rocks of Grand Canyon supergroup. This is clearly nonsense, as the lava falls are the youngest rocks out of everything in this picture. The radio dating method itself actually refutes itself. Now, for most of you, you can ignore this next bit. I already know there's going to be skeptics jumping up and down and getting really excited and saying, Dr. Austin used samples from different areas, and so the isochron isn't valid. All right. I will accept your argument if you also accept that this applies to the isochrons that the great E.D. McKee obtained in his extensive research in Grand Canyon radio dating methods, because that's the process McKee used. Austin was only following in the footsteps of McKee and used his very same technique. All right, so the radio dating method actually refutes itself. But let's take it a step further. Over the past several decades, there has been a battery of different radio dating tests applied to the Uinkaret lavas, the Uinkaret lava flows, trying to determine its age. The results have been rather wild, to say the least. 6 potassium argon radio dates returned ages of between 10,000 years old and 117 million years old. Might I point out, that's a difference in age by a factor of 11,700. 5 rubidium-strontium radio dates returned ages of between 1.27 billion and 1.39 billion years old. 1 lead-lead isochron test returned an age of 2.6 billion years old. And 1 rubidium-strontium isochron test returned an age of 1.34 billion years old. So please note that the difference between the youngest estimated age and the oldest estimated age is different by a factor of a whopping 260,000. So the different radio dating methods returned ages of between 10,000 to 2.6 billion years old. How on earth do you know which age is the correct age? Well, I propose we go with the lead-lead isochron age, seeing as how it's supposed to be the more reliable and accurate. So we will conclude that the lava rocks are 2.6 billion years old. Sounds impressive until you find out that there's Indian pottery in the lava flows. So we know the lava flows are actually 800 to 1,000 years old. Oops. So Dr. Gentry took coal samples from multiple coal mines in Colorado, dated on the evolutionary column as Eocene, Jurassic, and Triassic. Notice the time span involved here using the ages given by the deep time advocates themselves. The Eocene samples would be 37 million years old and the Triassic would be 245 million years old. That's a time span of 208 million years. So Dr. Gentry did find some pleochroic halos in the coal samples, but get this, they've been squished. The radioactive materials were apparently in the water, which was soaked up by the plants, and thus the plants wound up with little clumps of radioactive dirt in the porous wood. The materials started breaking down radioactively, creating spheres of radiation damage within the wood, radiohalos. The woody material was then compressed during the process of turning it into coal, so compressed by the tremendous weight of sediments of what is now the rock record, and so the radiohalos were also squished and compressed. There is something significant to be noted here. There is only one ring of radiation damage. That narrows down the list to one of 2 possible isotopes, lead-210, which emits beta radiation and would not produce a radiohalo, but transmutates into polonium-210, which is the other possible isotope for this halo. Polonium-210 has a half-life of 138 days, quite short. It takes at least 500 million radioactive decays, alpha emissions, to make a visible halo. For some of the radiohalos, as you can see here, the story ends there. However, Dr. Gentry also found some squished radiohalos that had further radioactivity occurring after the compression event. There hasn't been much radioactivity since that compression event, so the radiohalo is quite faint. Oh, wait! We can now use this as a clock. We know how many alpha emissions it takes to form a radiohalo. We know the element that made the radiohalo, and we know the half-life of that element. So it becomes simple math, because we can estimate how many emissions have gone on by the density of the fission tracks and divide it up by how many emissions per year you would get from that isotope. This is, in effect, a unique form of fission track dating. I mean, a half-life of 138 days? Stop and think about that. How many radioactive emissions are you going to get in the minimum 37 million years? Obviously, you're going to get into the billions of emissions, and thus very dark radio halos, which is not what we see. We see young radio halos. Just as significant as the polonium radio halos is what is not found. Radio halos from other longer half-life isotopes like uranium. I mean, presumably, there was also uranium in the water soaked up by the wood as well. So where are the radio halos from the other long half-life isotopes? Remember, this coal is alleged to be tens to hundreds of millions of years old. That is plenty of time for radioactivity to produce copious, very dark, old radio halos from even long half-life isotopes. So, where are they? The combined evidence shows that all of the events associated with this coal happened very recently. The soaking up of the water with radioactive dirt particles in it. The compressing of the wood into coal, the time since the wood turned into coal. Dr. Gentry summed all of this up in his paper in the secular, peer-reviewed journal, Science. Such extraordinary values admit the possibility that both the initial uranium infiltration and coalification could possibly have occurred within the past several thousand years. Because they collected samples from the Jurassic, and Eocene deposits, this would represent an evolutionary time of 37 to 245 million years, 208 million years total. The flattened pleochroic halos and the radioactive decay that took place afterwards conclusively show us that, in fact, 208 million evolutionary years were actually all one event a few thousand years ago. Exactly in line with the biblical account of a global flood and a few thousand years ago. Because we collapsed this huge chunk of the evolution column into one short time frame, we just collapsed this entire evolution column into one short time frame and event just a few thousand years ago. As profound as that evidence is, which I might mention has stood unrefuted for some 45 years now,